For this piece is pretty straightforward. We're going to begin adding all of the details to these flowers. And I absolutely love painting these. They're so fun and they're so simple. So this is what we're going to do. I've had to improvise a little bit here. So I'm going to add a little color to the centers of these flowers. I'm going to do that with a little bit of this color, which is that beautiful tea berry. I love that color. And we're going to thin it out a little bit, and we're going to float the centers of, not the centers of the flower, but the base of the petals where they join the flower. Oh, I've got a little too much moisture in here. So I'm going to bring that color in right to the center. Remember what I said about these petals, if they're not quite joining the center, it's okay. This is why, because we're going to join them in another method. Oh, I've got way too much liquid in my brush. Here we go. Okay. I have to pull a little of that color off. There we are. So we have a nice little float. So each of the petals gets shaded towards the center of the flower, just like that. Right down until it meets the center. So don't be afraid to go right over top of those little openings. It's okay. Those little flaws, I guess. In the end, they just make these flowers look more interesting. So nice little float down there with that tea berry. I love this color. It just adds a nice little blush to things. We still have white flowers, but they have that little hint of color, that little blush towards the center, which is always pretty. And this is not a complex flower. So we've got that little float in. Super easy. It changes this flower drastically. So then we're going to use that color to shade the centers of these flowers as well. Now I've used baby duck in the center, and we're going to float the bottom right or across the bottom of these flowers with a float of that tea berry. It changes to a nice, almost neon orange over top of that color. It's such a pretty shading color for that yellow. And then we're going to highlight the edges, much like we did with the chicken. We're going to do the same thing to the edges of these petals with a little float of titanium white. That does two things. It gives us a nice crisp edge. It's slightly more opaque at the edge of the petal, just a little. And then it diffuses the boundary between the warm white and that pink. So if you've had a harder edge in that float, this will soften that. Just makes things a little bit brighter. Gives the flowers a little crisper edge. And it's a super easy way to define things nicely. If you find that perhaps the edges of the petals didn't quite look sharp enough or defined enough, this is a great way to correct that. Just a little float of titanium white adds a nice little highlight and edge to things, but also cleans up any rough edges or little foibles that you may have. And I love that it sort of diffuses that boundary between that warm white. I have a knack for getting my arm in paint today. Between that warm white and that tea berry shading. Just softens things nicely. And then much like the leaves, I really like to have a softer edge on my petals. I don't like harsh edges, sharp edges. I think kind of takes away from things. And this is not a realistic painting to start with. So I'm going to put a little comma stroke there, and then I'm going to little irregular edge on each of these petals using that little bit of titanium white. I like that softer boundary. That works. And again, remember that gap that we were talking about. Using this little comma stroke at the base just helps connect the petals to the center. I think a lot of the time we worry about little details like that that don't really need to be worried about. And those little strokes of titanium white just help give things a nice little rustic edge. I like the imperfections in things. I like those little wonky bits. They look less contrived. I like when the petals have those little deep V's in them every once in a while. I like that none of the petals are exactly the same. Even though we use the same technique to create each one, none of them looks exactly the same. And then it just gives them more character and more interest. There we go. So fun. So now we have all that pretty texture on those leaves, on those petals. I've got a leaf I have to finish out very quickly. This one down here doesn't have a shadow on it. Doesn't have an outline on it because I forgot it was there. So I'm just going to tuck a little bit of that black green under there just so that it's grounded a little. There we go. Pretty, pretty. Now the centers of these flowers are going to get a really irregular treatment. I'm going to dry that real quick. I use my black gel pen for a lot of things. I like it for adding little textures and small little details, and I like what it does for things. So if you don't particularly care for it, you can leave this part out. That's not a big deal. I like to take a scribbly line around the center of my flowers. Just like that. Neatness doesn't count. It's just a scribbly line all the way around. And then I like to put a few little hash marks, little lines onto the petals like so. And at this point it looks pretty rough, but it's going to look fine in just a minute. But those little lines just add a little extra texture to the centers of these flowers and a little bit of interest. So on the highlight side of the centers, we're going to use little dip dots of white. So on the highlighted side, which is the side that's got the most white, we're just using a little bit of warm white. And I like to come past the edge of the flowers out onto the petals a little. It just creates a softer look to the center. And then on the shaded side, you're going to do the same thing with a little bit of asphaltum. Don't put them too close together. You don't want this to look heavy, so Just a few little dip dots. Just creates a nice little texture at the base of the flower and keeps the center from looking too heavy. So I'm going to dry that real quick. And then we're going to trace and transfer our lettering on. And this is, I think, probably one of my favorite things to do. I love the lettering on this. I like that it overlaps the design elements. And I also love that the lettering is imperfect, that it's not absolutely, they're not all exactly the same size, that they're not all fully opaque, that they have some quirks. Quirks are a good thing. And I think that appeals to me. But you can do all of those quirky things and still have really nice looking lettering. And I think it's important. Lettering should be straight and level, vertical and horizontally, so that it reads well. If it doesn't read well, and then it's a problem. So I've made a little mark top of my page so that I know where to place the top of my page. And I'm using the edge of the check as sort of a guideline to ensure that my lettering is straight, which it looks pretty good. So I'm going to tape that into place. Comme ça. And I'm going to use a little bit of white graphite. And one of the things I encourage people to do is to use a ruler when they're tracing certain types of lettering. If they have a lot of straight vertical lines in them, use a ruler when you're doing your tracing, just to ensure that they remain straight. It's virtually impossible to paint a straight line when the line you're working next to is not straight. If it is wonky, if it's not clean, it is virtually impossible for you to get a nice clean finish, a nice straight edge, if the line you're painting to is not straight. And so this just takes away some of the heartache by using a straight edge. And the other thing that I recommend is not using a plastic ruler. I know they're inexpensive. You can get them almost anywhere. I mean, you can get them in dollar stores for, a dozen for 10 cents. The only problem with them is that when they've been thrown into your drawer, when they've been thrown into your paint bin, it does not take very long for the edges to get chipped and dinged. And then when you go to draw a straight line, it's not straight. It's got all sorts of wonky bits in it. It just no longer gives you a clean line. I highly recommend go out, spend a couple extra bucks, buy yourself a good steel edge ruler with a cork back. Make your life a little simpler. The steel edge is going to hold up much better over the long haul, and you won't get frustrated with wonky edges. And when it comes to lettering, straight vertical and horizontal lines, very important. If you've ever walked into a room where there's 5 paintings that are all hung perfectly and one is wonky, it stands out like a bear on a bicycle. So you need to make sure that things are straight. Now, even freehanding, I've done this enough that I can get pretty straight lines even freehanding, but it's always a good idea to grab a ruler, especially for vertical and horizontal lines. Why torture yourself? It does make life a whole lot simpler. Not only that, but your design work looks so much better. And I missed the M. Oh my goodness. Nothing will ruin a beautifully painted piece faster than poor lettering. If a design piece calls for lettering, it should be as clean and perfect as the rest of the painting. And it can be very frustrating to finish a piece and discover that, it's going uphill. So take your time when it comes to putting your lettering on. Take your time painting it so that when it's finished, the lettering, has that same beauty and same dedication to the finish that everything else did. I grabbed my gel pen. I did not grab the red one. So now I can't tell where it's been. So I'm just double checking everything. There we go. And the same goes, even though this word poultry is a pretty rustic font, it is still very important that those vertical and horizontal lines be clean and straight. And so a ruler comes in very handy. Just a nice little 6-inch. You don't need to have much. Curved elements, because they're curved, they're a little more forgiving. Just make sure that any vertical and horizontal lines in them are straight and level. If your lettering is going uphill and it is not designed to go uphill, it doesn't look right. We are conditioned to read things from top to bottom, left to right. So very important to get those vertical and horizontal lines as straight as possible. And all of those little curved bits, like at the base of these letters, whatnot, those, you can get away with doing those freehand because they're rounded. They don't have to be meticulous. Those are a little more forgiving. The vertical and horizontal lines are certainly less so. There we go. So just make sure all my T's and P's and L's are nice and straight. And even the U. Well, that's got a nice curve at the bottom. There's 2 vertical lines that really need to be nice and straight. Almost there. I'm just going to quickly check here in a minute to make sure everything is as it should be. Now, before I remove that line drawing, I'm going to switch out my graphite for a gray graphite so that the tops of the letters, just because they're over top of those flowers, the white graphite kind of goes missing. So I'm just going to quickly draw that in, just so I know where the stop and start is. That's all. I think that should have done it. Almost. Gonna do the T. There we go. A little bit. There. Okay. So we have our lettering in place. Looks pretty good. Everything's reasonably straight. And Poultry is a little out of whack, but we can make that work. So the color for Poultry is Bahama Blue. And we're going to put a shadow in it, sort of a dropped shadow behind the lettering. We're going to use some thin dash Faltum for that. So a little bit of thin dash Faltum. I'm using a number 2 rigger. And I'm really thinning this paint out. It does not need to be very thick. So I'm putting a line next to the inside edge and the right side of each letter. And it's about the same width as the letter. So if the element that I'm working up to is a 1/16 of an inch or an 1/8 of an inch, then I'm going to paint that shadow about the same size. So just like that. And this is just a little dropped shadow. Just going to give the lettering a little elevation off of our surface. There we go. And so that little shadow just gives the lettering that little bit of elevation off of the surface, which we need. And then we're going to come up here to the Farm Fresh, and we're going to do something similar. Going to do that with, you can do it with either a float of thin dash Faltum. It needs to be a little bit darker because we're working on that red. So I'm going to put a little bit of lamp black into it, just a little. And I'm going to do the same thing. So just a wee float. You could float that in with your regular brush if you want to. I'm just putting in just a small line on either side. So a float, I'm going to do it the same way, just create sort of a little drop shadow on this letter. And it's roughly the same thickness as the one below. So about an 1/8 of an inch or 1/16 of an inch. And that little shadow is going to give us a little bit more dimension to our lettering. Just like that. I like doing all of this before I paint the lettering. That way, when I do paint the lettering, if there's any areas that have kind of overlapped with things, the painting the lettering cleans that all up. So we have our shading in. Now, I'm going to do this one down here, that Poultry. We're going to thin out a little Bahama Blue. Use a little bit of your glaze to get it moving. We want the paint fairly thin. Now I'm using a number 2 rigger. And the nice part about this brush is that I can simply press down until the brush fills the space that the letter is going to occupy. And that number 2 rigger fills that space very nicely. And not only that, but it gives you a lot of control. It's a very easy brush to work with. It's long enough that it'll fill up the space. It also will hold a lot more paint than you expect. I can paint this letter with one brush load. And there's still lots of paint left in it. Now for this particular piece, I really, really like the more rustic appearance of this type of brush lettering. It's the imperfections that make this. So I really like the fact that the lettering is imperfect, that it is not this cookie cutter or stamped appearance, that it has that hand-painted look, which appeals to me, which is what I wanted for this particular piece. I have other pieces that I've designed that use lettering where the lettering has to be a lot crisper, a lot cleaner, and a lot, and more attention to making sure that everything is fully opaque, that everything is perfectly straight. But there are times, I think, in the design process where those things are not necessary. And this is one of those times. Straight and level, absolutely. Distressed, worn, imperfect, absolutely. Love it. Just like that. I like the imperfections. And right now these look a little rough because you can still see all the graphite lines. And we haven't highlighted them yet. So shading and highlighting make a difference too. The bottom of this one is not quite right. It is paint. You can always fix it. There we go. So Poultry is done. I love how that looks. I'm going to dry that real quick, and then we're going to tackle the Farm Fresh. I'm a big fan of the Farm Fresh up here because it does not need to be fully opaque. It's going to look a little worn and distressed, and if it doesn't, we're going to make it look worn and distressed. So that's nice and dry. Now the color I'm using for the lettering for Farm Fresh is warm white. And I'm using a little bit of Joe Sonia's. I'm going to pull this down so you can see. Now your paint, again, needs to be fairly thin. You don't want it watery. It's got to come off the brush nicely. And we're essentially going to be doing block lettering. So I'm going to use the rigger to do those vertical lines. I like the rigger for this because it has a nice chisel edge. You can use the chisel edge to create those horizontal bars or almost a calligraphy type look to it. Because the brush will square off, you can get those nice squared bottoms and those nice squared edges very easily. Not to mention, it's a fun brush to work with. Now, I am not worrying about whether or not this paint is fully opaque because I'm going to distress this lettering anyway. And I really like the imperfections for this piece. So, and it's that same thing again, just press down until the brush opens up and fills the space, and then pull the stroke. And I love the irregularities in this. I just think it's fun. Easy peasy. So just continue until you get the lettering all filled in. Of course, I missed a couple of spots there, so I like the irregularities. Oops, too much liquid. Gonna be very watery. Oops, there we go. And then there's the S. The S is always the one that seems to give people the most grief. And there we go. So we have farm fresh poultry. I'm going to dry this. We need to do a little shading on this lettering, particularly this one down here, that poultry. So we'll give the farm fresh a chance to dry. We're going to come down here, and we're going to use another one of Decorate's new colors, which is Stormy, a favorite. I love this color. I'm going to rinse my... I'm going to switch to a 3/8 angled shader, and I'm going to use a little bit of Stormy. We're going to float the bottom of the letter with a little bit of Stormy, which is that darker blue, and then we're going to pull some of that color about halfway up the letter. Doesn't have to be perfect, doesn't have to be neat. Little float, pull some of the color up. All that's going to do is give the lettering a little bit of weight, a little bit of visual weight. So that little bit of darker color at the bottom just lends this a little more weight, a little more substance, so that it doesn't look like just somebody drew on the lettering with a marker. We need it to look like it's got a little bit of weight, which it does. And then the lettering up top is also going to get shaded, but not until we distress it. But it needs to be dry before I do that. Otherwise, I'll make a mess. So I'm going to grab my little sanding sponge. I have a little one here. Oopsie. And we're going to distress this lettering a little bit. And I'm doing this vertically. And I'm focusing just on the letters. Oh goodness, that wasn't dry. I thought it was, but it wasn't. Oh no. Oh well. So, a little distressing. Just enough to wear through the lettering. And even though I did not intend to do that, I don't think it's really that much of a problem. So I'm going to grab my fugly brush. I'm going to take a little bit of water. There we go. Oh yeah, that's fine. So a little bit of water just to wipe off any dust. And then we're going to shade the bottom of each of those letters with a little bit of asphaltum. So, little asphaltum. I use a little bit of water, a little bit of Joe Sonia's. We're going to shade the bottom of each letter with a little float of that asphaltum. It's going to come about halfway up the letter. So, neatness doesn't count for this. If it goes onto the background, that's okay. Don't worry about it. It's not a problem. So there we go, about halfway up. Kind of like now that that did that, but wasn't my intent. There we go. So Farm Fresh, got that nice little bit of antiquing along the bottom. I'm going to dry this, and then we're going to spatter it I like to use 3 colors. I like a little bit of asphaltum, a little bit of lamp black, and a little bit of warm white. I like all 3 of those for spattering. I find if you just use black or if you just use asphaltum or any one of those darker colors, it makes things look very heavy and very dark and dingy. So I like to have a little bit of light in there. So I use a little bit of warm white. I need my fugly brush. So I got my favorite fugly brush, a little bit of water. I'm going to start with a little bit of lamp black. And I'm going to just spatter this lightly. We don't want a ton of it on there, so I like a fine spatter. Here we go. Nice little fine spatter of lamp black. So much for my manicure. And then I'm going to do the same thing with a little bit of asphaltum. I love asphaltum. It just gives more texture without making things too dark. And then the last thing we're going to do is thin out a little bit of that warm white. And this just keeps everything from looking, as I said, a little too dingy and perhaps a little too heavy. And so I tend to be a little more heavy-handed with the warm white, but it's just a little. And I'm going to dry this. And then the only thing we have left to do is to paint our bee. Now you can paint the bee directly on, which I think is what I'm going to do with this one, but I'm just not sure where I want to put it. So we're going to do a little bit of tweaking in a couple of places. I'm going to, a little bit of asphaltum. I want to darken this little piece down here underneath our chicken. You can do that with a little bit of asphaltum and lamp black combined. It's just to deepen that shadow, brings the chicken forward a little further. There we go. I like it. There we are. So this is where you get to tweak everything. You adjust shadows, you change things that you need to change, brighten things that need brightening. This is a great time to do that. So in the original piece, I used one of these, which is a laser cut bee. I'm not sure where I want to put my bee. I'm going to paint it directly onto this piece, but I want to show you how to paint these bees. These ones are super fun. So I'm going to start with warm white. And the wings get base coated with warm white. And these actually work up very quickly. And I'm going to put a little bit of warm white here. And we'll dry that. And then I'm going to paint the legs and the rest of the body with lamp black. So lamp black. And then a little bit of baby duck for the body of the bee. It's down here on the thorax. You need that baby duck. That nice bright yellow. So there we have a bee. I'm going to put another coat of white on his wings. They're just not quite bright enough. These little guys work up very quickly. There's not a ton of detail to put in, and most of it is implied. So he's easy to paint. Now, his body has 3 segments. His upper body has 3 segments. He has a head, he has a shoulder area, midsection, and a thorax. So I'm going to dry this real quick. And we're going to define the various segments of his body with a float of warm white. So I like to little float, on the head. And then you're going to leave a small space, very small space. And you're going to come down till it reaches about the top of the wings. It's another little float. And then another small space, and then a float down until it meets the body. And there we have the 3 segments, the head, the upper thorax, and the thorax. The wings are going to get shaded close to the body and out at the tips. I always like to put a little bit at the tip. So, especially on these larger bees, you can do it. So a little float of Bahama blue close to the body. Nice and tight. It's not a huge float, it's just a little one. And then you're going to repeat that out at the tip of the wing. Just a little bit at the tip of the wing. Just gives the bee a little more shape, a little more definition. Just a little more interest. Now to shade the thorax, same as we did with the flowers, we're going to use that tea berry. So a little float of tea berry. I'm going to put it on the right side, just like that. I love that this tea berry over top that baby duck has an almost neon effect. It's very pretty. So it's just a little float. And then we're going to start putting a little bit of the minutiae in. Let's make sure that's dry. I'm going to grab my liner brush. I do love my liner. And a little bit of thinned lamp black. And we're going to create a fuzzy butt on our bumblebee by putting a little cluster of small lines right here. And then about halfway down the midsection, we're going to put a series of little thin strokes like so. And I want them to be fairly loose and overlapping so that they give that fuzzy appearance to the bumblebee. And then on the highlight side, which is the lightest side, so the side with the white, the side with the yellow, we're going to put a dot of white, a little stroke of white here, a stroke of white there, and then just a few little hair-like highlights on the highlight side of the body, just like that. Now I'm going to dry that, and then we're going to finish off our bee. He paints up very quick. So the rest of the bee, on the wings, a few little fine lines close to the body, and then a squiggly line all the way around the outside edge of the wings. I just like this detail. It just keeps it very soft and light looking. Nothing too over the top. And the same along the body. I like to have that little squiggly line on the body as well. Throw in a few little dots on the shade side. And there you have your little bee. Now, you can decide where you would like to place him. In the original, I placed him right here. And that works very well. But there's nothing to say that he couldn't be out here somewhere or up here. You can place him wherever you want. He can overlap the lettering. He could be tucked into a corner. Wherever you decide to put him is going to be just fine. So I hope you guys enjoyed painting Farm Fresh. I love this piece. This one is going to be framed and set up in my kitchen. Here is the original, is done on this 8x10 postage stamp surface and uses the dimensional B. Also love it. This one could be hung using a wire. It could go on a front door. You could use it for almost any kind of decorating that you would like to do. So this is Farm Fresh Poultry. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for your patience and for taking the time to watch. I love you all. Have a great week. Mwah. See you again soon.